Hey Knights! So, there's like 4 chapters left, so I decided I'm just gonna finish off this book. Story, fan fiction for y'alls. Yeah. So, chapter 13, Barrel Ride. It took Thorin a few moments to process what had just happened. Even when he'd passed under the fallen tree, he still half expected the orcs to reappear out of thin air. And he had to have imagined the orange blur jump from the water, but he didn't, and they never did. He glanced around, catching Balin, who looked as confused as Thorin felt, as well as totally miserable and disabled from being thrown around in the turbulent water. But he didn't have time to dwell on this, however, for he was pushed away with a strong current. The chaos continued. Orcs attacked the dwarves from all sides, and elves surrounding the orcs. The dwarves had very little to defend themselves, if anything at all, and they just had to make do with what they were able to catch from any falling orc or the occasional elf. Thorin was engrossed, too preoccupied with trying not to drown or be killed to notice anything going on around him. Water hit them all from every angle, getting in their eyes and pouring down their throats. The barrels they were in were luckily sturdy, otherwise they would have crumbled by now from all the rapids and rocks. Poor Bilbo was holding on to Keely's barrel for dear life. He may know how to swim, having taken his fair few dips in a river that ran through the Shire, but he knew fair well he stood no chance on waters like these. His grip was already beginning to wane, and despite Keely trying to hold on to the hobbit, he was injured, and his strength fading. Bilbo's hands cramped up, and when one moment he was bracing himself for an oncoming rock, and the next he was forced underwater. As soon as he got below the surface, he was whisked away, being pushed and pulled through the current. He clawed desperately at the water, but wasn't strong enough to reach back to the surface. It was then he saw her. He instantly stopped scrambling and let the golden-haired girl wrap her arms around him and pull him towards the surface. He broke the water with a gasp, Amara's arms still tightly around him. "Amara!" Philly yelled, and instantly Thorin's head snapped around so fast he nearly lost balance and fell out of his barrel. He had been deaf to the world until then, too busy trying to fight off orcs, but as soon as he heard that name, it hit him like an arrow in his heart. Desperately, his eyes scanned the turmoil of water, finally landing on Amara, who was trying frantically to push Bilbo into a barrel. Eventually she did, and quickly disappeared beneath the waves, again without even a glance at Thorin. Thorin's heart fell to his stomach at those brief moments. Her brow had been furrowed in worry, her eyes black from adrenaline, and her teeth bared with danger. If it was possible for his heart to speed up, then it would have. But unfortunately, he wasn't able to dwell on her, for the scenario was far too demanding for any lack of concentration. He turned back around, and to his surprise, she was already ahead of him. He watched as she jumped from the water, landing on the bank corner with an unusual amount of grace for her. Her legs already in place for when her feet touched the rock. Her sword was drawn, and in a few strikes she struck an orc. Before it had even crashed to the floor, she was off again, running towards an orc who was aiming an arrow past Thorin and towards Feely. Feely's head snapped around, and his eyes widened when he saw the orc. Instantly, he started thrashing around in his barrel to get out of the line of danger. But he hadn't need to, for Amara closed the distance between her and the orc, her shirt clinging to her and her feet bare. In one swift moment, she tackled the orc from its middle, pushing it with her into the turbulent water to drown it. This behavior continued, and Thorin had a hard time not continuously scanning the water for the mermaid, eyes desperately searching for her to make sure she was all right. Every time she was, of course. The dwarves continued down the river, and eventually they lost sight of the orcs. having fallen down several waterfalls and having no travel. The water finally began to relax and shallow. Turning around a corner, they saw a rocky embankment, and sitting on one of the rocks was Amara, seemingly nursing a cut on her leg. Without hesitation, Thorn pulled himself from his barrel, and the rest of the company followed. The commotion in the water they caused caught Amara's attention, and she stood, eyeing each of them up with a blank expression. The company stopped behind Thorn, who had halted just before her, unable to believe what he was seeing. She looked ill. Everything about her was wrong. She didn't glisten in the light. She didn't glow with joy and excitement, and her hair was dull as her empty eyes. Amara, Thorn began, eyes searching her, guilt-ridden in his stomach. Was this because of him, after all this time? It finally dawned on him on how much his actions may have affected her. Lord Elrond had said mermaids were tied heavily to their emotions, but it had never occurred to him that she might have been at risk because of him. His eyes trailed up and down her thin frame. She was even smaller than when he'd last seen her, and it looked as though someone had completely taken away the light from within her. Thorn reached for her, but she looked straight past him. "Keely!" she cried out, her voice no longer its musical tone, but raspy and cold. She quickly brushed past Thorn, ignoring him, and ran to Keely, who sat by his brother, holding onto his leg tightly. Amara quickly reached him, forgetting completely about her own injuries and turning her back to Thorn. For a moment she hesitated, crouching down beside the young dwarf. She put her hand to his face, her expression suddenly grave, as she gently moved his stray hair from his eyes. "I'm so sorry," she mumbled, pulling him towards her and cradling him. Suddenly, being so close to her, Keely relaxed somewhat, feeling the pain in his leg ebb away slightly, and letting himself be gently manhandled by the strange girl. He could hardly complain when his face was being squeezed into her chest. "Typical guy." "What brought you back?" Thorn sent a demand after a long minute, once again offended by her greeting, or lack of. Instantly his tone caught her attention, more than his actual words, and she looked back round on him. The sudden change of angle cast a slight shadow over her, highlighting her sunken cheeks and deep-set eyes. "I made a promise to them. Obviously I failed to keep it." She seemed genuinely upset, and she pressed a kiss to Keely's forehead with the pale orange lips, pulling him tighter to her. Keely numbly complied. Thorn's mind flip-flopped as he watched her cradle Keely. She looked devastated at the fact he was hurt, but surely she did not truly care. He watched as she pulled Keely away and turned her attention to his leg. She pursed her lips tightly, eyeing his wound sadly. "I'll be fine. It's nothing," Keely told her through clenched teeth. But Amara's frown told that she was not convinced. That was all Thorn needed to hear. "On your feet," he commanded, moving away. "Keely is wounded," Amara replied, turning back to him as if he didn't already know. "There's an orc pack on our tail. We keep moving." He snapped back unnecessarily, but nevertheless he moved away, suddenly wanting to be away from her and away from her disinterest in him. It stung, to say the least, for her to be so cold to him. He just strode past Balin when something sharp hit him in the back of the head. If he didn't have such a thick skull, it would have hurt. He spun around, glaring at Amara, who was now standing, unconsciously mirroring his stance with her legs rigid and fists clenched. His sharp tone hadn't gone unnoticed then. "You said I was a vile creature," she hissed, her eyes growing dark. "Clearly you have no heart at all." Thorn took a threatening step towards her, deeply offended by her words and trying to be virile. "Excuse me?" he demanded, his eyes glaring daggers and his anger raging within him. Keely was his nephew, his own flesh and blood, who he treated and loved as if he was his own. Her words hurt. "Your nephew is clearly injured," she began, then took another step forward, but Thorn cut her off. I am well aware that he is wounded. We must keep moving to avoid further injury or any fatalities. Like I said, there is an orc pack on our trail." Amara knew he was right, but she had a lot of pride and refused to be proven wrong, especially by him. So instead, she bent back down and scooped up another stone, this one larger than the last, and threw it at him again. Thorn managed to catch this one, but anger burnt in his eyes. "Watch what you're doing, half-breed," he spat, leering her in with bait, and by her reaction, he knew she took it. She stomped her foot. "I am not a half-breed," she yelled, closing the distance between her and the dwarf. Although fear sat him, Amara found herself floating slightly as soon as she drew near enough to him. Something in her chest ached for him. "I am a mermaid, a full breed. How would you like it if I was to call you something you're not? Pint size? Pint size? And what does that make you? A shrimp?" Amara gasped and her ears burned in anger. They were so close now, nearly nose to nose, as they glared at each other, their anger escalating, their tension building. The rest of the company stood around awkwardly, not entirely sure why the argument was escalating so quickly. Bilbo was the only one who clocked on that this was an outlet for them. He knew something had happened between Amara and Thorn before they left for Findel, and this seemed to be, even after all these months, their way of releasing that irritation. Bilbo knew Amara well, and knew very well that she was clearly distressed. He knew her health had vastly deteriorated, and by the way she was scowling up at Thorn, with balled fists, he couldn't help but wonder if Thorn was the issue. They were picking holes in each other over nothing. Both of them hurt, but neither knew nothing of it. There was obviously some underlying issue between them which was causing these reactions. Amara knew she'd miss Thorn, and she was so close to him. It took all her willpower not to just throw herself at him and embrace him. This desire feeling just seemed to rile her up even more, though. She was supposed to be angry with him, and she was supposed to hate him, but she couldn't. She was releasing all the emotion she kept bottled up over the past few months all at once. Hatred, desperation, longing, annoyance, anger. But most of all, she was extremely upset. Thorn could have very nearly died during the orc attack, and yet he was still swanning around like nothing had happened. He could have died. This thought made the bridge of her nose and her eyes sting, and he didn't even seem to care. Everything simply came spilling out, causing the argument to increase faster than intended. What? Give me a moment. Yeah, well, I much prefer to be a shrimp with a nice nose instead of one like this. She reached up and grabbed Thorn's nose and pulling it harshly. Thorn battered her away, grabbing her hand and pulling it away from his face, but he didn't let go. Instead, he stared down at her, his eyes flickering over her face. It was her, but it wasn't her. Mara stared up to him, still furious and quickly planning her next insult. She watched his face and accidentally got caught in his bright blue eyes. Suddenly, Thorn pulled at her wrist, and with a squeak, Amara was pulled forward and pressed up against him. The next thing she knew, Thorn brought his lips down on hers, one hand still wholly judging her wrist, and the other snaking around her waist. Amara just blinked, sitting there awkwardly and not entirely sure what to do. Although whatever Thorn was doing was indeed odd, it wasn't entirely unpleasant. His lips were warm and surprisingly soft. The kiss was only brief. Thorn had felt Amara go rigid and hastily pulled away, looking back into her eyes. For a moment, Amara just blinked at him, and then suddenly she grinned, her pale cheeks rapidly turning a rosy pink and her eyes sparkling slightly. Thorn let out a sigh of relief and pulled her towards him once more, this time engulfing her in a warm hug. This Amara knew how to do, and she gladly returned the hug, her hands holding the back of his tunic tightly, as if she was never going to let him go, which in fact she was planning to never ever do again. The introductions with Bard had been extremely uncomfortable for Amara. She didn't like humans, she didn't trust them, and she didn't want to be near them. But there she was, on the barge, while she searched around in her bag. "What are you looking for?" came an unmistakable voice from above her. She didn't reply for a moment, and Thorn thought that she may have been ignoring him again, but suddenly she jumped, clutching a pair of trousers in one hand and a pair of shoes in the other. "These!" she grinned at him, before promptly dropping the shoes and leaning one arm on Thorn for support while she poured the trousers on, rather ungracefully. Once pulled up, she slipped on her shoes, which didn't have laces, thank goodness, before straightening up and smiling at Thorn proudly. Being back in his company had made her feel wonderful, the best she'd felt in months. She couldn't get enough of him, and she couldn't stop thinking about when he put his lips to hers. She felt top on the world. "Are you cold?" Thorn was looking at her with concern. She clearly was not in the best health, and now they were sailing through ever-cooling climate, and she was soaking wet with very few layers. Amara shook her head. Nope, she generally wasn't. When wet, she didn't get cold. It was only when she was dry that she felt the temperature. Waters always felt wonderful to her, rigid regardless of the temperature. Thorn didn't press her, but did give her an unconvinced look, while she continued to smile up at him. "Amara," Thorn began, rubbing his temples, "may I have a word with you?" Amara's expression faltered, but she nodded, letting Thorn lead her away into the other side of the barge and away from the nosy dwarves. Next page. I must apologize for our last meeting, Thorn began again, watching her carefully and leaning one hand on the wooden rails of the boat. I spoke out of turn again, and I must confess what caused me to do so. He paused again, almost desperate for her blank expression to change, but it didn't. She didn't give him any indication what she was thinking. She just blinked at him. I have grown rather fond of you, and the idea of your departure rather bothered me. Despite being the confident, strong, brave warrior he was when it came to speaking of emotions, he was rather inept, even more so when it came to an unpredictable water dweller. He waited patiently for a sign, a noise, anything to help him. After a while she did speak. What was that thing you did? What thing? By the river, with your lips. When I kissed you? Thorn was a little surprised, and suddenly a tad bit worried that he may have stepped over the line with such a bold act. Amara nodded slowly, her gaze dropping to his lips. Her next words were like music to the dwarf's ears. Do it again. It's a very bold statement. Okay, so chapter 14. More barrels. Do it again. Amara waited, feeling somewhat nervous as Thorn simply stared at her, unblinking, and eyes slightly larger than usual. He then took a step towards her, one of his arms sliding around her waist to sit at the small of her back, and pull her into him. He raised his other hand to lightly caress the side of her face with the back of his thick fingers. Amara leaned into his touch, purring slightly, and letting him pull her closer, still, until she was pressed up against him. Instantly, Amara was engulfed in the smell that was Thorn Oakenshield, earthy, smoky, and musty. A smell that was so foreign to her, but yet so homely. Her eyes were already shut, and she didn't open them until she felt her chin being gently pulled upwards. Opening her eyes, she found herself gazing up into Thorn's striking blue eyes. Amara smiled slightly, letting him once again put his lips to hers. The kiss was light, teasing, almost as if Thorn was still cautious. But this time Amara kissed back, standing on her tiptoes and leaning into him, letting her body mold into his. Thorn's mouth began to move against hers slowly, deepening the kiss, and Amara purred in pleasure, her noise prompting the dwarf to tighten his hold on her in return. It wasn't until there was a loud wolf whistle from behind him that Amara came crashing back down to earth. So more or less jumped away from Thorn, face as red as a beetroot, but still buzzing pleasantly from the interaction. Her head was swimming, and her body felt as though she was floating. The only part of her that seemed grounded was her heart, which seemed to be racing abnormally fast. She turned to where the whistle came from, spying Buffer, who looked far too pleased with himself. Turning back around, Amara found Thorn sculling at the hatted dwarf. Amara took another step towards Thorn, poking him in the chest to gain his attention, before reaching up and placing a small, delicate kiss on his temple. Thorn looked surprised for a moment and just blinked at the mermaid as she swanned away again. Aye, lass, you don't happen to have any coins, do you? Amara turned to her Ballins, who was sitting on the barge decks, surrounded by various piles of coins. Amara thought for a moment. No, she replied, but she wandered away towards her bag, grabbing it before making her way towards Balin. She began fishing around in it. I have these. Amara opened her hand, and all the dwarves leaned in to get a better look. Are these yours? Ophelia asked in slight awe, taking one of the large golden scales from Amara's outstretched hand. Yes, Amara replied, fidgeting slightly, ignoring Thorn's questioning gaze. Can I have one? Ori asked before earning a prompt scold from his eldest brother. You can't ask for one of her scales, Ori, Dory snapped. They must be worth a fortune, Boffer added, taking also one from Amara's hand. Really? Amara blinked. Aye, how often do you see a mermaid scale floating around? Ori went to hand back the scale to Amara, but she simply stared at it. Would you sell it? She asked him. No, it's so beautiful. I'd keep it forever, Ori replied, stroking a thumb over the golden surface and staring at it longingly. Amara smiled. Keep it then. Are you sure? Amara nodded. Uh-huh. I don't need it, she replied awkwardly. Thank you. Ori held it to his chest, grinning from ear to ear. Some time later, and 4 scales lighter, having given Keely and Beely giving Keely and Bilbo one also. Amara found herself indulging herself with the dwarves. She sat next to Buffer and Bomber, happily listening to them chat away about their adventures that she'd missed. Will you be staying with us now, lass? Buffer inquired, and Biffer grunted. Amara rubbed the back of her neck. I don't know, actually. She was planning to stay as long as she felt like it. That's how she'd been living for the past few months, staying in one place until she felt like moving on. She'd enjoyed it, too. She loved the freedom of doing whatever she wanted. I have never planned on leaving you for good, she finally replied honestly, grinning at each of them. No sooner than the words had left her mouth, she had gained a hard smack on the back. Good lass. In the time she'd passed after that, the weather had worsened. A thick fog ascended over them, and they found the weather getting even colder, signalizing their progression further north. Within the next hour, the company had fallen completely silent. Everyone watching in tense wonder as the landscape changed. Watch out, Bulfer cried, just as a large stone column came out in the fog. Amara felt uneasy even when Bard skillfully veered the barge out of line of the danger. She scrambled up from her seat beside Bilbo and hurried over to Thorn, who stood by the boat's edge. She took hold of his hand. What are you trying to do? Drown us? Thorn growled to Bard, glaring up at him. Drowning wasn't a concern for Amara, as it was impossible for a marine creature to drown, but she was worried about the rest of the company. She hid partly behind Thorn, tucking herself right into him for comfort and warmth. Although still slightly soggy, she was no longer wet, and therefore growing increasingly colder. She eyed the water to her left, and she stood facing Thorn. I was born and bred on these waters, Master Dwarf, Bard replied sullenly. If I wanted to drown you, and I would not do it here. Amara looked up at Thorn, who didn't look convinced. He continued to glare at the bargeman. I've had enough of this lippy lakeman, Dalin grumbled from behind her. I say we throw him over the side and be done with it. Amara peered over the side of the barge then, surveying the water and ignoring Thorn as he tightened his grip on her hand as she neared the edge. Oh, Bard. His name's Bard, Bilbo replied in an exasperated tone. How do you know? Balfour piped up. Just then, Thorn pulled Amara away from the edge, leading her to stand with the rest of the company before folding his arms over his chest. Amara went to stand on the other side of Bilbo. I asked him, Bilbo replied matter-of-factly from his position leaning against the mast. I don't care what he calls himself, Dalin exclaimed in an equally gruff tone as his last comment. I don't like him. Amara couldn't help but agree. She didn't like humans in general, and she was very skeptical of them, and even though this particular human was helping them, she didn't know if that was cause enough to change her entire opinion on the race. However, Bard seemed nice. He'd helped them so far, and although Amara wasn't particular to humans in general, Bard wasn't a threat in her eyes. You do not have to like him, you simply have to pay him, Balin interjected from his spot on the floor, still counting out coins. Amara glanced over to see her scale sitting on top of one of the piles of coins. Come on now, lads, turn out your pockets. The pile of golds were too small to be from the entire company. The company grumbled in response, but did as they were told. While the dwarves were searching and suddenly finding unexpected extra pieces of gold, Amara's sharp ears picked up on Dalar's raspy tone. How do we know he won't betray us? Glancing back towards Dalin and Thorin, Amira caught Thorin's gaze, just as he was turning away. We don't. Ah, there's a wee problem, Balin sighed. We're 10 coins short. Everyone grumbled and moaned again, and Thorin came to stand beside Amara, on the left side of the mast, leaving Dalin to stew on the right side of the boat. He crossed his arms over his chest. Gollin, come on, give us what you've got. Gollin spluttered, looking mildly offended and particularly guilty. Don't look at me, I've been bled dry. Amara raised her brows and opened her mouth to offer another scale when Thorin sent her a look, one she knew meant she had to keep her mouth shut when given. Thorin turned back to Gollin, and Amara continued to stare up at Thorin, her eyes taking him in. He was no longer wearing his heavy, thick armor, and so his shape was more visible. In fact, although far from small, he wasn't as big as he appeared with all his layers on. Even though it sounded stupid, Amara found herself somewhat surprised. Her eyes trailed from the striky eyes eyes trailed from his striking eyes, down his sharp nose, and over his lips that she loved so much, and down to his wide shoulders and hard, flat chest that just made her want to rest into him. She followed down his abdomen, letting her eyes linger on his thick, muscular forearms. Then to his narrowed hips, her eyes trailed in to the waistband of his dark, damp trousers, then down to his heavy, squared boots. She began to shuffle awkwardly beside him, gaining his attention back from the defensive dwarf to her. "What is it?" he asked, watching her as she wriggled around, squeaking slightly. "Nothing," she fibbed, avoiding eye contact. Her stomach felt funny again, but not like butterflies. It was much lower in her stomach, and it made her feel uncomfortable, although at the same time it wasn't unpleasant and made her want to giggle. Thorn was about to say something when he stopped himself. His gaze drifted from Amara. All the dwarves had seen it too, except Gwalin, who was still ranting away. The company stopped what they were doing, all slowly turning to the same spot, watching in awe as through the parting mist the silhouette of the lonely mountain came into view. For a long moment everyone was silent, too captivated by the sight to process anything else, except Amara. Her gaze flickered to every one of the company in turn, then back to the mountain, then back again. She didn't understand the big deal about a load of rock and earth. "Well, bless my beard," Golan breathed, suddenly fishing out a dirty look punch from within entire. "Take it. Take all of it." He brandished the pouch of coins towards Balin. The moment was abruptly cut off by Bard jumping from his position by the wheel. Instantly, Amara retreated back at his sudden approach. "The money! Quick! Give it to me!" "We will pay you when we get our provisions, and not before," replied Thorn matter-of-factly, unmoving from his position, covering Amara. "If you value your freedom, you'll do as I say." Bard pressed his arms still outstretched in desperation. The tone of his voice, the expression on his face, and the look in his eyes when they flickered momentarily towards Amara was enough to tell her that they should do as he says. Wordlessly, she poked Thorn in the back, and when the dwarf turned to look at her, she nodded towards the gold. "No," he hissed to her, and Amara frowned. She slipped past him and scooped up the coins herself, dodging Thorn's outstretched arm as he made to grab her and disposing them into Bard's hand. "Thank you," he said, nodding in appreciation. Amara turned back to the company. She made towards Bilbo, but Thorn stepped in front of her. "What did you do that for?" he hissed in a whisper, and Amara frowned again. "We are in his boat. We do as he says," she replied sternly, challenging Thorn's hard gaze. "Don't disobey me again." Amara fumed at this, but chose to simply ignore him. Sidestepping the dwarf, she continued her journey to Bilbo. There was a lot of commotion to get dwarves into the barrels as Bard neared the closest dock. They downright refused at first, squabbling loudly with the barman as Amara and Bilbo waited patiently for their barrels for the dwarves to comply. Of course, they eventually did, although they were not happy about it. "What's he doing?" Amara heard Dallin growl to Bilbo from inside his own barrel. Bilbo's barrel was closest to the dock where Bard had just pulled into, and was subconsciously using this advantage to spy on the bargeman. "He's talking to someone," Bilbo replied from within his own barrel. Amara sat quite comfortably in her barrel, legs pulled up to her chest as she absent-mindedly tugged on various parts of her shoe. "Shashi," she hissed to herself when she pulled the thread loose. "What's wrong?" she heard Thorn's voice from her right. "Let me finish!" But she ignored him. He pointed right at us. Bilbo continued, and Amara heard him move around in his barrel. Now they're shaking hands." "What?" Thorn hissed. "He's selling us out," Dolan added menacingly. It was then the fish came, a few at first, and then heaps of them, completely filling up each and every one of their barrels. Amara squeaked as the cold fish hit her, but once her barrel was totally full and finished with, she wasn't entirely bothered. She just sat there contentedly amongst the fish. Thorn, on the other hand, wasn't so content. In fact, he was fuming about being stuffed in a barrel in the first place, and now he was coated and covered in fish goo. Ugh. Within a few moments, the barge jolted back into motion, and suddenly they carried on their way. The whole time the dwarves moaned and groaned, occasionally earning themselves a hard kick from Bard to shut them up. "Quiet," he snapped. "We're approaching the toll gates." The entire company was trapped in the darkness that was cold, smelly fish. The only member who didn't seem to mind the confinement of fish was Amara, who was nibbling on one quite happily. It wasn't long before the bard began to slow again. "Halt!" A voice came from apparently out of nowhere. "Goods inspection. More humans." Amara thought and inwardly gagged on her fish, instantly losing her appetite and pushing it away. "Papers, please," the voice called out again, just as the bard slowed to a complete stop. The company waited with bated breath, scared to be found. But they needn't worry, for the voice piped up again, suddenly more cheery. "Oh, it's you, Bard." "Morning, Percy," Bard greeted. "Anything to declare?" the one named Percy asked. Amara frowned. There obviously was something to declare. "Nothing," Bard replied briskly, "other than I am cold and tired and ready for home." There is a noise of someone moving around on the deck, the barge, most likely Bard. "You and me both," sighed Perry. There was a brief silence. "There we are, all in order." "Not so fast," came another voice, and Amara slid further down in her barrel. She didn't like the sound of this other person at all. As soon as the slimy words came into her ears, she cringed. It was tense hearing all this happening outside the small world that they were invading, that was their individual barrels. For all they knew, they could be caught out at any moment, but there was nothing any of them could do about it. They couldn't actually see anything, only hear the going-ons, and Thorn especially waited with gritted teeth. "Consignment of empty barrels from the woodland roam," the slimy voice continued. "Only they're not empty, are they, Bard?" There was the sound of someone approaching, the heavy, slow steps as the person reached the woods of the barrage. Amara instantly knew it wasn't Bard that was moving, and gulped, suddenly worried they would be found. "If I recall correctly," the voice drew nearer and louder, as did their steps. "You're licensed as a bargeman, not a fisherman?" "That's none of your business," Bard replied quickly, maybe a little too quickly. "Wrong. It's the master's business, which makes it my business." "Oh, come on, Alfred, have a heart. People need to eat," Bard pressed. "These fish are illegal," the slimy voice countered. "Empty the barrels, over the side." Amara's heart plummeted. What would happen if she was caught? What would happen if the company was caught? Thorn was just as worried, although worried to him was to portray as another state of anger, and he continued to shake with rage within his barrel, and brooding fiercely. "You heard him. In the canal," another voice ordered, and instantly half a dozen other footsteps followed, all stomping their way around the barge. "Folk in this town are struggling. Times are hard. Food is scarce," Marsh insisted. "That's not my problem," the slimy voice replied, just as Amara's barrel began to shake as someone moved it. "And when people hear the masters dumping fish back into the lake and the rioting starts, will it be your problem then?" Amara's barrel began to tip, and she muffled a squeak, light beginning to seep through the new openings as the fish slowly began to slide into the water. "Stop," the slimy voice commented after a painfully long silence. Amara's barrel stopped tipping, but the man steadied it, turning his attention away. Momentarily losing concentration, and the barrel skidded on the wet deck, falling forward and rolling into the water, along with Amara. Lake Town. "Why is it always her?" Thorn snapped loudly, heavily pacing heavily up and down Bard's home. He was furious at Amara and at himself. He'd only just got her back, and now she was gone again. Where even was she? Would she be able to find them again? Was she safe? I'm sure she'll be back. "I'm sure she'll be back in no time," Bard tried reassuringly, thumping Thorn on the back for good measure, when the raven-haired dwarf had finally stalled in front of a large window overlooking the water. "I hope you're right," came Bard's gritty voice, catching Thorn's attention immediately. "Why? If the master or any of his slimy puppets caught even a sniff of such a creature, she'll be good as dead," Bard replied sullenly, moving from his post leaning against a wooden pillar and striding towards Thorn. He stopped short next to his eldest daughter, however, and put an arm around her comfortably. "And what sort of creature do you believe her to be?" Thorn glared warningly up at Bard, uneasy that he'd ratted them out so soon. Bard returned Thorn's stony gaze. "I've told you, Master Dwarf, I was born and bred on these waters. I know what a mermaid is." As soon as the word mermaid rolled off his tongue, he caught the attention of his 3 children, all of which gawked at him in utter shock. "Mermaid?" the youngest repeated, her expression mixed with alarm and excitement. She then turned her attention to Thorn. You have a mermaid amongst you? Had, Thorn corrected, only glancing at her for a moment before returning to glare at Bard. We had a mermaid. Bard moved toward Thorn again. How, may I ask, did you manage to keep such a creature? Obviously, we haven't been able to keep her, Thorn replied bitterly, breaking eye contact out of wounded pride. And what do you mean, keep her? I mean, to tame a mermaid is unheard of. Never have I ever heard of such a story, let alone see it with my own eyes. Tame her? It looked like you had. I never knew mermaids could possess a quality such as loyalty. Thorn didn't know if it was good or bad, so he simply decided to press on the important matters. How do we get her back then? How can we find her? She found us before, did she not? Billy chiped in from his position, caring for his brother, whose face was distorted in pain. Aye, but that's because you were in danger. As if on cue, although it was apparent Keeley hadn't been listening, the younger dwarf let out a cry of pain, clutching his leg desperately, as if he was trying to wish it better. Thorn came to Keeley's side, momentarily forgetting about Amara. How are you feeling? Fine, Keeley choked out quickly. I'm fine. Thorn frowned. He wanted to say more, but was cut off by a lapse in train of thought. His attention snapped towards a far window, along the rest of the company. He watched in alarm as men suddenly rushed around outside, yelling and calling to one enough, frantically and scrabbling around for knives and sacks. Thorn shot Bard a questioning glance. I think we may be too late. Amara yelped, tugging desperately on the tight rope that pulled on her tail in an attempt to free herself. She felt the surface drawing closer, and she clawed frantically at the water around her, grabbing onto a nearby rope that was used to anchor a boat to the lake's bottom. But her efforts were useless, for whatever she was pulling on, the other end of the rope was too strong. In one moment she was in the water, the next she was pulled onto a wooden pier. Instead, she felt multiple hands on her, and she cried out in pain as she was shoved and pushed. Everything was a whirlwind, faces moved around her vision, and she tried desperately to lash out and defend herself. But she was too weak. Her once tough skin was soft, leaving her susceptible to pain. The next thing she knew, the rope around her tail was tightened, and she was flipped onto her stomach. Her hands were roughly grabbed and bound together. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw an old man advance on her, his toothless grin menacing as he watched her with hungry eyes. In his hands he held open a sack, and in one swift moment he thrust it over her head. Amara screamed once more, trying to fight against them all and free herself from the blinding sack. She was then dragged, the damaged wood planks splintering into her delicate skin. She continued to thrash and squirm, but every time she did, she earned a harsh blow to her ribs or stomach. Eventually she tired and gave up. Thorn watched the crowd with gritted teeth. If he still had the Orchist, he'd vanquish every single one of those men. But he wasn't able to. The provisions and weapons Bard had promised them had been useless, and once again they were vulnerable. And Thorin Oakenshield hated being vulnerable. We have to do something, Thorn exclaimed, glancing towards Bard with a menacing glare. Bard clenched his jaw. Come, but stay hidden. It wasn't hard to stay hidden in Laketown now, as there was no one to stay hidden from. The entire population had apparently taken interest in the sudden comings of merfolk and joining in the hunt. It didn't take the company long to find Amara, and Thorin watched in utter horror as Amara was drawn upside down by her tail before the master's house. Her limp body swayed with every tug until she was suspended on a makeshift wooden mount. Now what? Thorin hissed to Bard, but not taking his eyes off Amara's lifeless form, internally praying for her to move, just an inch. Bard clenched his jaw once more, as if complementing a hard decision, but he did nothing immediately. Instead, watched as the master's front door swung open, and the master emerged, followed closely by Alfred. At first, it didn't look as though the master noticed Amara hanging there right in front of his nose. Instead, he swayed a little, obviously intoxicated, and blinked a few times. It wasn't until Alfred tapped him on the shoulder that his blank gaze finally focused, and he saw Amara. The master simply stared at Amara for a long moment, and Thorin clenched his jaw, his eyes boring into the fat, boorish man as he staggered down the steps and towards the mermaid. The master circled her a few times, eyes wide in disbelief. He then raised a chubby finger and poked her. Thorin stiffened, his teeth clenched so hard his gums began to ache. The only solace Thorin gained was that Amara moved a little, wriggling faintly in an attempt to move away from the unwelcome finger. At least she was alive. Where did this creature come from? The master asked the crowd, flashing a nasty set of decaying teeth. Such a breed hasn't been seen in these parts for more than a century. My wife spotted her, my lord. A shabby-looking elderly man stepped forward, his knees buckling under his own weight. We were hoping you may offer us a reward for such a creature. He looked weak, as he stood there, swaying slightly, he looked helpfully up at the master. At this, Alfred slithered down the steps of the master's house and came to stand behind him, whispering something to his ears. 2 gold coins, the master finally spoke, once Alfred was done. 2 gold coins? Was that all Amara's life was worth to these sick people? Thorn's fist clenched until his knuckles turned white and his own fingernails pierced his skin. The elderly man seemed to have a similar thought to Thorn, for he stared in shock at the master as he fumbled unsteadily with the silk coin pouch. Only 2, my lord? He blinked, glancing from Amara to the master. Yes, I don't even think she's alive. He barked a laugh, a cruel, empty sound filled the air. I'm doing you a favor. Dead half-breeds are bad luck. She is not a half-breed, Thorn boomed. His temper had finally snapped, and he pushed past Bard, completely ignoring the mixed looks of horror and shock from the townsfolk. She is not a half-breed, he repeated in a growl, glowering menacingly at the master and his slippery sidekick. Let her go. Upon hearing Thurin's voice, Amara began to squirm. One moment she was hanging lifelessly by her tail, and the next her tail had split in 2. She dropped from her ropes and fell to the ground with a thump. Scrambling up, she quickly ran to Thorn and hid behind him. And exactly what are you supposed to be? Drawled Alfred, stepping in front of the master, who looked too confused to speak. He gave Thorn a hidey glance up and down, taking in his shabby attire. Some sort of desperate mercenary? The master should have your head for treason. Hold your tongue, Dallin suddenly came, pushing through the townsfolk to stand beside Thorn. You do not know to whom you speak. This is no common criminal. This is Thorn, son of Thorain, son of Thoror. Amara peeked out from around Thorn, watching the master and Alfred with large eyes, a plan slowly ticking away in her head. We are the dwarves of Erenborn, Thorn added, his voice, its usual rumblings cascade of velvet. We have come to reclaim our homeland. And with that, a wave of murmurs spread through the crowd. Seeing this, Thorn continued, I remember this town in the great days of old. Fleets of boats lay at harbor, filled with silks and fine gems. This was no forsaken town on a lake. Thorn turned to the townsfolk, enticing them in with his words. Amara took a step away from Thorn, eyes searching the crowd as the rest of the company emerged. This was the center of all trade in the north. If you grant us this favor, I will grant you yours, and I will see to it that those days return. I will relight the great forge of the dwarves, and send wealth and riches flowing once more from the halls of Erenbor, right into your hands. He then turned back to glower at the master. But you must let her go. Thorn knew exactly what they'd do to Amara if they could. They would cut out her heart and descale her. Thorn decided then and there that he was going to fight for her. To him, Amara was worth 10 times more than all the gold in Erenbor. The master looked convinced, and the fact he was sullen as soon as the word gems floated into his ears. However, before he could open his mouth to speak, Alfred swooped in, whispering in his ears. Amara watched Thorn. She no longer saw the cloud of sickness that hung over him. The burden of his kin seemed to sweep off his shoulders. This, Thorn, was no fallen prince. Only one more chapter! This Thorn was no fallen prince. He was a mighty king. As he spoke, power radiated from him, and his words fought the illness that was festering in the back of his mind. Death! Bard drew Thorn's attention away from Alfred. That is what you'll bring upon us. Dragon fire and ruin. If you awake that beast, it will destroy us all. Bald was more concerned about Smonk and his wrath than Amara's well-being. He had panicked when he'd heard Thorn's plan and would rather have one mermaid die than the entire town perish. Amara's eyes flickered around the crowd at his words, her gaze falling upon the young and the old. Bard was standing before Thorn now, looking utterly stressed. But Thorn persona remained calm and collected, and his reply was just as smooth. He was pushing for Amara and the company's freedom. You can listen to this naysayer, but I promise you this. If you comply, all will share in the wealth of this mountain. Amara watched the faces of the crowd change from worry to pleasure, and she frowned. You will have enough gold to rebuild Esengarth 10 times over. At Thorin's words, the crowd cheered. All of you, listen to me. You must listen. Bard turned desperately to the crowd, and Amara took an involuntary step towards him. But Thorin stopped her. Have you forgotten what happened to Dale? Have you forgotten those who died in the firestorm, and for what purpose? Bard then turned and looked accusingly down at Thorin. The blind ambition of a mountain king, so driven by greed, he could not see beyond his own desire. Now, we must not, any of us, be too quick to lay blame. Let us not forget that it was Garan, Lord of Dale, your ancestor, who failed to kill the beast. The master of Laketown had apparently finished being coaxed by Alfred, and had finally decided to join the dispute. It's true, sire, Alfred added, smiling sinisterly, almost mockingly. We all know the story. Arrow after arrow he shot, each one missing its mark. You have no right to enter that mountain, Bard said quietly to Thorin alone, taking a step towards him. I have the only right, Thorin replied sternly. Thorin then turned to the master. I speak to the master of men of the lake. Will you see the prophecy fulfilled? Will you share in the great wealth of our people for years and years to come? Or are you going to waste this opportunity for a slim chance of mermaid magic? He took a step forward. What say you? The master seemed to hesitate for a moment, before smiling slyly. I offer you a proposition. Oh? Thorin raised his brow at the master, disapproving of the smug smirk Alfred was sporting. Amara's gaze was glued to the master. She knew exactly what was coming, and she knew exactly what she was going to do. You will have my blessing. You will have the entire town's support from now until evermore. Any provisions will be provided, from pots and pans to the finest boats. But he leaned down toward Thorin's, wafting his foul breath all over the dwarf. But not only do I ask for Aragorn's trade, I ask for her. The master then pointed a dirty, chubby finger at Amara, who just watched back with an unreadable expression. And if I refuse, Thorin replied, I will make sure you and your little friends are locked away until the end of your days, and I'll take your little mermaid anyway. The master flashed his gruesome teeth once more. What say you? Thorin opened her mouth, but Amara cut him off. He accepts, she said loudly, in a bold voice no one knew she had. In a few swift strides she stood between the master and Thorin, standing with poise and purpose. A sense of sudden nobility suddenly surrounded her, and the air in her vicinity was caked with sudden power and energy. I will go with you, on the condition you do exactly as Thorin wishes. Thorin instantly grabbed Amara, pulling her around to face him. She stayed surprisingly calm. Are you a fool? Thorin muttered. They will kill you, Amara. They will take your heart. She smiled, glowing a rich, deep gold for the first time in weeks. She reached up and cupped either side of Thorin's face with her small hands. Thorin Oakenshield, it is not theirs to take. She then brought her lips to his in a short, sweet, tender kiss. She then moved her lips to his ears and whispered, I will see you again. Look to the water and say my name, and I will come. She was then pulled away by guards. The whole time she smiled softly at Thorin, as he just stood there. Just before the doors of the master's house was shut, she called in a voice that reminded Thorin of water leaping at the shore. To Nalamem. Okay, last chapter. I don't even know how to say that. I'm just going to say last chapter. Amara waited patiently as she laid on the uncomfortable, firm, makeshift bed. She could hear and see the humans shuffling around her, preparing her and gathering equipment such as bowls, towels, and knives. She twiddled her thumbs absent-mindedly. Are you afraid, Siren? Came the familiar slimy voice. Amara tilted her head slightly to look behind her. No, she replied nonchalantly. Why would I be afraid? Alfred slithered closer, his yellowed, crooked teeth on show through his malice grin. Because you are about to meet your end, creature of the deep. He is trying to provoke her, to get a reaction out of her, to make this experience ever more satisfying for himself. But the way that Amara let out a light, breezy laugh, Alfred actually became confused for a moment. She seemed so confident, it nearly threw him off. Nearly. If you say so, mastered Alfred. She began to pick at her nail casually. Alfred peered over at her, expecting to see some hidden fear deep in her eyes, expecting to find that she was trying to be brave, and this airiness was just an act that she was hiding behind. But no. As far as Alfred could see, she was completely confident and unfazed by the web she was currently entangled in. Curiosity crept on in Alfred. He wanted to know the source of her relaxed attitude, and then he wanted to squash it. He wanted her to feel fear. He wanted her to be afraid. You do not care that you will be leaving your beloved king behind? He was trying to bait her for some reaction, and for a fleeting moment he thought he got one, for Amara paused, looking thoughtful. I will not be leaving anyone behind, Master Alfred, because, to be honest with you, I plan to go nowhere. I don't plan to go anywhere. She sat up then, leaning forward. Her nose was just a few inches from his, and when she continued, her voice was no more than whispered. I'm just playing along, you see. I actually find all this quite entertaining. Her eyes flickered black, and the jewels that peeked out at the top of her shirt flashed blood red. Alfred's eyes popped slightly, unable to conceal the alarm that washed over him. He wasn't stupid. He had heard the tales and stories, and he knew exactly how dangerous she could be. I will pierce you with that blade myself, my dear, he hissed, his eyes as threatening as his tone. Amara giggled. Oh, Master Alfred, you cease to amuse me, and you will cease to exist. Very well, good luck. Her cryptic words taunted him, and if there was one thing Alfred hated, it was being belittled and mocked. Good luck. My dear, poor siren, it is not I who will need the luck. Let's just hope your waves will accept you back. Fraternizing with the landfolk is hardly acceptable behavior for a water child. He was trying to turn the mocking back around on her, but, in fact, his anger only escalated with a small smile gracing her peach lips. I will not be seeking acceptance. I will not be returning to the waves. I am wishing you good luck for the curse, Master Alfred. She paused, eyes flashing once more, pouring into him for a reaction. She got one. Just a flicker of confusion on Alfred's pasty face was enough for her. Oh, you do not know? But, sir, you seem to know so much of me and my kin. I just assumed, she trailed off, her small smile pointing tauntingly. Curse? She leaned forward even more, her lips hovering right over Alfred's ear. At the close proximity, he could smell the alluring scent of her, the fresh open air and the cool, crisp waters of the waves. Yes, the mermaid's curse. When Amara pulled away, her eyes were once more black, and her fangs seemed dangerously sharp. Out of fear, Amara's temper snapped. Where's that knife? He sneered down at Amara, whose expression was far too smug for his liking. Quickly, let's end this siren's wretched life. However, when he brought the knife down to Amara's chest, as soon as the cold metal spike touched her skin, she disappeared, leaving in wake only a puddle of foamy salt water. The battle raged and swelled outside the halls of Erenbor. Thorn fought with Fili and Kili at his side, always keeping a constant eye on them. He was willed with his new determination, new anger, and he was fueled by grief and revenge. From the corner of his eye, he saw Balin strike and work twice his size with his club, and beyond him sat the lake, glistening and shimmer in the dying light. The atmosphere was thick with dirt, blood, and sweat, clinging to his lungs as well as his skin, and there was a strong, potent scent in the air, a mixture of copper, blood, and death. He would not give up. He would not end this way. They had come so far and fought so hard, it was too late to back down now. This was his kingdom, and he was the king. His sword swung, slicing into the advancing goblin and bringing it to the ground in a crumpled heap. Anger coursed through his veins, anger towards the men of the lake town, those blasted wood elves, Bilbo and that Arkenstone, but what also burned him was the rage towards that mermaid. He spared a glance to his nephew, quickly assessing them for injuries, but it was hard to tell through all that blood and mud that coated their bodies. Sweat glistened on both of their brows, but Fili was showing stamina. He was fighting as if he'd just started and not at all like he had been nearly an entire day. He only had a minor injury, a large gash on his upper bicep, although it did not seem deep, nor was there any sign of poison. Kili, on the other hand, was showing signs of fatigue. His leg was clearly still a burden to him, despite the injury now being several weeks old. He was panting heavily, breathing raspy, and not to mention that he kept wiping the sweat that was dripping from his brow and into his eyes with the back of his hand. He was clearly exhausted, and Thorn was beginning to grow concerned that he would make an easy target. Kili, Thorn yelled, making quick work with an oncoming orc and heading back towards his youngest nephew. The ground was strewn with a corpse and weapon and debris, and the thick mud made any fast pace nearly impossible. Keeley merely glanced at him, far too preoccupied with a small group of goblins to give Thorin its entire attention. Thorin joined him immediately to captivate one of the creatures. "How are you faring?" he asked, turning his back to him to engage in another goblin. "I'm fine." You could hear he certainly wasn't fine, but Thorin just nodded. He could hear Keeley struggling for breath, feeling him fight to stay up. Thorin gritted his teeth, concern filling his gut and anger brewing in his chest. Where was Amara now? She was supposed to be here. She promised to protect them. Keeley needed her, and where was she? Dead. That's where. Word had quickly reached him the next day that Amara had been killed. He almost brought his axe down on Alfred's head when he had found out he was responsible. But Donlin and Gollin had held him back. It was then he had seen something in the man's eyes. He didn't look smug or proud like Thorin had half expected him to appear. On the contrary, he looked disheveled and sick. Something lurking behind his eyes. Something that wasn't human. Amara had told him she'd all right. She'd promised she would return. But now, no hope. All he could do now was concentrate on the situation at hand, keep his kin safe, and reclaim his kingdom once more. He felt an entire new wave of motivation wash over him, a new incentive to not give in and to prove everyone wrong. He could certainly keep his promises, even if Amara couldn't. He turned once more, focusing his attention on a large orc, but not without one final glance at the partly frozen lake. Feely held Keeley tightly to his chest, rocking back and forth and trying to fight the damp of tears that was ready to burst. He was past caring now, past caring if he was an easy target to the enemy. All he could think about was his little brother going limp and cold in his arms. "Keeley, no!" He struggled to find words, raising a hand and using his thumb to wipe some bloody strands of hair that stuck to Keeley's forehead anyway. Keeley stared up at him, chest barely rising and falling, and he struggled to gulp. His lips moved, but no sound escaped. It was then a single tear rolled down Feely's cheek and fell onto Keeley's temple. For a moment, Feely just stared at the bright turquoise liquid that rolled onto his brother's hairline. Instantly, Feely choked out another sob and raised his hand to wipe his eyes, only to find his fingers were glistening with the same bright liquid. Keeley saw it too, for his brow twitched into a frown, and he too shed a single shimmering tear. Feely watched as it leaked from his brother's left eye and trickled down his face, leaving a trail of bright turquoise. Feely didn't get much time to dwell on this, though. From behind him, an unmistakable yell filled his ears. Whipping his head around, his eyes instantly found the source, and he involuntarily let out a sob, letting more bright tears escape his eyes. Thorin lay on his back, having been thrown to the ground, weak, exhausted, and clutching at his right side, just below his rib cage, blood pouring through his armor and clothes and oozing out over his fingers. Before him, a large orc advanced towards him, axe raised at the ready of the final blow. "Here comes the end of the line of Dorne," the creature growled. Thorin's eyes unfocused, hazing over upon seeing Feely crouched over Keeley, holding him tightly in his arms. About 10 meters away stood another orc, raising its bow and drawing an arrow prepared to shoot. "No," Thorin breathed, eyes never leaving his nephew. The orc chuckled menacingly, baring its crooked, stained teeth. "Any last words for the king under the mountain?" Thorin's eyes unfocused more, and everything in his short sight blurred, and the lake beyond took over, merging everything into a sweet blue haze. "Amara, please." The orc before him frowned, unsure of what to make of that. But it didn't hesitate for long, and he moved forward once more, preparing to raise the axe over his head. Thorin squeezed his eyes shut and clenched his jaw for a moment, before daring to return his gaze to where Feely and Keeley once sat. His heart clenched when they were nowhere to be seen, nor was the orc who was aiming to shoot at them. His breath caught in his throat, and he once again shut his eyes, mentally preparing himself for the blow. He wanted to die now. He didn't want to live without his nephews. He never should outlive them. Images of Feely and Keeley flickered behind his eyelids, from when they were just babies and learning to walk, to when Keeley first got his bow, and to when Feely got his first braid, all the way up until when they reclaimed the mountain, and when Smaug was finally destroyed. The look on their faces when they laid eyes on the large stone doors, flagged by the statues of their kin. The look upon their face when they realized they'd made it, when they realized they had done it, and despite all odds, they'd all survived. But then the battle came. 5 armies marched that day, and the casualties were already in horrendous numbers. Numbers Thorin didn't want to contemplate. Then the images of water seeped into his mind, smooth, calming waves, and the sweet, sweet smell of fresh ocean air filled his lungs. Amara, he breathed, remembering the dream he'd had of her all those months ago. The dream that had once scared him, but now seemed so inviting. Yes? Thorn's eyes snapped open and his heart pounded in his chest. He must be dreaming. He must have been killed already, and those large golden eyes gazing down on him are just part of his last moment of consciousness. But no, there she was, eyes glowing and lips grinning deliciously. Her hair fell around Thorn like a veil, and if he had more strength, he would have reached up and touched those glistening locks. Then she was gone, and his heart retched in his chest for a moment before he realized she was standing at his feet, legs spread in a threatening stance, and sword clasping tightly in one hand. Across her hip, her bow and arrow were tied, and by the variety of man, elf, dwarven, goblin, orc, and her own cobalt blue arrows sitting tightly in her quiver, it looked like she had already done a little bit of gathering before reaching Thorn. Her long hair hung wet down her back, her tunic soggy and clinging to her legs and bare feet, an obvious sign that told that she literally just clambered out of the water. Keely, Thorn breathed, his words only just audible to himself, so he was sure she wouldn't have been able to hear him. But her sharp ears twitched, and before answering, she knocked an arrow, aimed, and shot in a matter of seconds. They're fine, she glanced back round at Thorn, taking hold of her sword once more. I promise. That's all Thorn wanted to hear before he finally let himself go. The first thing that Thorn noticed was the comforting smell of burning fire. The crackling and popping sound of the wood was soothing and therapeutic, and the feel of soft furs and linens under his fingers made him feel safe. Slowly he blinked his eyes open, frowning into the dimly lit room. Instantly he recognized the chambers, and he immediately tried to sit up, but a sharp pain in his right side caused him to yelp out in agony. He felt a large, strong hand on his shoulder, and a tankard of an ale instantly appeared in front of him. Usually I don't recommend drinking with wounds, but it'll ease the pain. Owen's voice came from his side, and he held the tankard up to Thorn's lips. Get Amara, Owen said quietly to someone else. Thorn then noticed Ori hovering behind him, and he nodded before hurrying out of the room. If it wasn't for Owen practically forcing the ale down Thorn's throat, he would have asked many questions. But he had to wait until the elder dwarf was satisfied before gasping out his first word. Amara? He barely let himself have a chance to breathe before her name fell from his chapped lips. His voice was shaky and hoarse. She's here? She's alive. Owen smiled comfortably. Aye, she's the only one in the entire kingdom who hasn't been worried senseless about you. Kingdom. Thorn frowned, but Owen quickly added, She knew you'd be all right, Thorn. She knew there was nothing to worry about. Thorn let out a deep breath, letting himself relax back into the pillows once more. Slowly his eyes began to droop. Just before he fell back into a deep sleep, he heard the door creak open. Thorn? Amara peeked her head around the large oak door, just in time to see Thorn's eyes shut. She smiled silently to herself and wobbled into the room, doing a sloppy job of stabilizing herself with the wooden crutches she'd been given. Her right leg was heavily bandaged and was having great difficulty of walking with just one leg. Bearing in mind she was only just capable of walking with two. She still looked ill, and she felt it, too. She was thin and still somewhat deceitful, looking with pasty skin and sunken eyes, but as soon as her gaze landed on Thornton, she brightened a little. Feely trailed in behind her, his arm in a sling and with a slight limp in his step. He grinned broadly, having the physical content, the large, booming cheer that threatened to escape his throat upon seeing Thorn awake, if only for a fleeting moment. The two took a seat either side of Thorn on the large four-poster bed. Feely instantly reached towards to clasp a large hand on his uncle's shoulder, squeezing a little, still totally overwhelmed by the fact he was here, alive and breathing. Amara took hold of Thorn's warm hand, and at her touch, Thorn stirred once more, but he didn't open his eyes. How is he? Feely asked, sparing one glance towards Owen before returning his gaze to Thorn. He was talking. I think he'll be fine. Amara reached forward and took a dark strand of hair behind Thorn's ears that lay over his face. He looked so exhausted, she said quietly. Behind her, she could hear the sound of the door creaking open once more, and the noise of 10 more dwarves shuffling into the room, each mumbling to one another. So do you, lass. Amara ignored this comment from Balin and continued to stroke the side of Thorn's face affectionately. Her fingers slowly trailed down his jaw and over the thick bristle of his beard, gently down his neck and over his chest and to the right. She frowned when she found the wound under her fingers. It's a miracle that axe didn't cut him in half, Dallin rumbled from behind his brother. noticing the look on Amara's face. Literally missed a fatal blow by less than an inch. "Do you have any water?" Amara asked, blinking up at Owen. He had hesitated for a moment, unsure of what she was doing. "I'll get you some," he said, slowly rising to his feet, watching curiously as Amara pulled the fur blanket that covered Thorn just enough to reveal his right side, but still cover the left side of his torso and both legs. When she began pulling on his tunic, Balin quickly stepped forward. "Lass, I don't think that's a good idea." Again, Amara ignored him and finally freed the material and pulled it up just enough to expose the bandages of Thorn's wound. She slowly began to peel them away. "What are you doing?" Ori asked. Amara finally managed to gently remove the bandage, trying to ignore the groaning and wincing from a still unconscious Thorn. Feely tried to soothe his uncle, and for a while it worked, but then Amara pulled off the last bandage and exposed the weeping gash to the air. It caused Thorn to yell out. The skin around the injury was black and blue with bruises, and there were small patches of the injury that oozed pus and other bodily fluids. At that moment, Owen returned and nearly dropped the pole on seeing what Amara had done. "What are you doing?" he asked in uncharacteristically sharp tone. "Helping him," Amara replied, looking at him with worry. Owen took a good look at the injury, showing her concern. It was a lot deeper than he first thought, and it wasn't healing properly, ruining the risk of infection. By the looks of it, Thorn was already on thin ice. Slowly, Owen handed the bowl of water out to Amara, still skeptical about what she was planning to do. Feely was the only one who knew what she was doing, having seen her do it to Keely, and supposedly have it done to himself. So he stayed back a little, watching in awe as Amara carefully placed the bowl on the bedside table and dipped her hands into the water. Instantly, the clear water turned a shimmering turquoise color, and from behind her, she heard the movement of 10 dwarfs shove her closer. She removed her hands from the bowl and turned to Feely. "You'll need to hold him down," she told him, her voice low and laced what sounded like regret. Feely looked confused. "What? Why?" Amara didn't reply, instead gave Thorn one last apologizing look before firmly placing her hands over his wound. It became immediately clear why Feely was meant to hold Thorn down, and he quickly grabbed his uncle's shoulder at the raven-haired dwarf's body arched violently, and he let out a deafening yell of torture. Thorn's eyes snapped open, and he tried to twist away from Amara's hand so forcibly, Feely struggled to hold him in place. "Dalin!" Feely yelped, and instantly Dalin was at Thorn's side, letting Feely concentrate on Thorn's left shoulder, while Dalin held down his right. Thorn rolled out once more in sheer agony as he stopped moving at much, apparently realizing who was holding him down and no longer thinking he was under attack. He continued to wince, yell, and squirm in pain. However, then, all of a sudden, he stopped. He let out a groan, once again falling back against the pillow and pulling his arm to lay over his eyes. Sweat coated his brow, and his chest was heaving heavily. Amara removed her hands, eyes lingering with a patch of skin that only a few moments ago totally covered with a horrendous injury. The rest of the dwarves strained to get a good look, all muttering at the now untainted skin. Amara offered Thorn a small, apologetic smile, eyes dancing with amusement as the dwarf just glared angrily at her. The skin where the open wound was now replaced with a glistening golden scar, like a crescent moon over his right side that went from hip to ribcage in a jagged fashion. It was soft to touch and reminded them all of Amara's skin when she was healthy. "At least it doesn't hurt anymore," Amara offered, still smiling lightly. Thorn just grunted, still scowling. "Keely and I have one too," Feely grinned, rolling up his trouser leg to reveal a long, shimmering line that went down his knee to his near ankle. "Keely, is he?" Thorn trailed off, dread curling in his stomach when he noticed his younger nephew's absence among the group. His eyes traveled from dwarf to dwarf, assessing them each in turn. "The lad's absolutely fine," Balin smiled, leaning against the foot of the bed. "Thanks to a certain little mermaid, he's just resting at the moment." Thorn turned his attention to Amara and offered her what could nearly be called a smile. "I suppose I can't stay mad at you then." Amara was still fussing over Thorn's tunic, but her smile dropped at his words. "You were mad at me?" "For a few moments. That was the worst physical pain I've ever experienced," he muttered, barely meeting her gaze. Amara looked sheepish. "I'm sorry, I've only done that a few times." She paused for a moment, but her groan returned. "You managed it pretty well, though." Feely leapt from one side of the bed to where Amara was perched on the edge, quickly muffling her with his hand. "Let's not tell the king that." Thorn hesitated for a moment while Feely's words sank in. "King." "Aye," Balin grinned. "We did it. King under the mountain." And just like that, the entire company bowed, except Amara. She looked with a confused expression as what they were doing before meeting Soren's gaze and grinning broadly, obviously not understanding. Yay, it's all done. That's actually the second time I've read that, and it's so awesome. So yeah, and then tomorrow I will be doing again live broadcast around noon Mountain Time. So yeah, please tune into that. Alrighty, I love you, Knights. Peace out.